Warning before we get started. Throughout this video, you might hear some language that's no longer considered socially acceptable. Specifically, you're going to hear the word retarded used a lot. While in modern language, this word has been relegated to specific medical diagnoses, throughout most of the 20th century, it was a commonly used word for a multitude of different disabilities. One of the things to think about after we've read of Mice and Men is the role of Lenny's disability. While the book never gives an exact diagnosis, it's obvious that Lenny suffers from some form of an intellectual disability that affects his entire life. Life in America for people with disabilities is incredibly different today than it was in the past. To say that we didn't truly understand intellectual abilities or that we didn't treat people with all types of disabilities well throughout most of our history in America and the world at large, including the 1930s, the setting of Mice and Men, would be a pretty big understatement. But before we get into how the life of people with disabilities and their role in our society has changed, we should also talk about how California has changed in the past 100 years. Today, we think about California as the most populous state, home to multiple large cities, Hollywood, dozens of professional sports teams. We think about Napa wine country, the Golden Gate Bridge, and Redwood National Park. If California became its own country tomorrow, it would have the seventh largest economy in the world, more than countries like France, Italy, Brazil, or Canada. There are only 9 states in the US that have at least 10 million people living in them, yet just Los Angeles County has a population over 10 million. California's population as a whole is approaching 40 million. Good enough that it would be the 37th most populous country in the entire world. What we think of California today, however, is not what it has always been, and certainly not what it was in the 1930s for the characters of Mice and Men. In 1900, the entire state of California was less than 1.5 million people. By the end of the 20s, however, that number had climbed to over 5 million on the promise of a massively booming economy. But the state had grown too quickly and didn't have the foundation it needed to handle hard times. The stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression was devastating to the country as a whole, but specifically to California. Farming income in the state in 1932 was half of what it was just 3 years prior. In 1932, unemployment reached 28%, and by 1934, 1 in 5 people in the state were receiving some form of government assistance. That's the California that George and Lenny were living in. Throughout the terrible times of the 1930s, however, the population of California still continued to rise. By 1950, the population of California had nearly doubled during the previous 2 decades and was now well over 10 million. Refugees from the Dust Bowl and middle of the country farmers put out of work by the Depression streamed towards California's ever growing cities, often finding whatever work they could along the way, much like our vagabond protagonists in our story. In the first half of the 20th century, the population of Los Angeles County grew from 170,000 to over 4 million. The 1930s in California was a time of great turmoil, but also a time of great transition. When California became a state in 1850 following its acquisition from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, it was home to just a tiny white population and a multitude of different Native American tribes. In what is far too complicated and long of a topic to address completely in this lesson, the first white settlers in California committed some of the worst atrocities in American history. It is estimated that 100,000 Native Americans were either directly murdered or died as a result of white settler pillaging and looting between 1850 and 1870. 100,000 people were murdered in just 20 years. Following that genocidal subjugation of the native population, California was little more than a vast wilderness with little in the way of development or government structure. But less than a century later, by the middle of the 20th century, California was home to some of the country's largest labor unions, featured a robust and entrenched state governmental bureaucracy, and a state funded university system featuring 10 campuses and nearly a half million students. It's important to remember when thinking about Of Mice and Men that the California that George and Lenny experienced was not yet the California that we know today. It was becoming that, but it wasn't quite what we think of when we think of that state now. Much like California's drastic change over the course of the first half of the 20th century, the lives of Americans living with disabilities changed drastically during the second 50 years. Today, every school in the country employs special education teachers. Official announcements from the government always feature sign language interpreters, and accessibility considerations are built into public spaces. But these advancements in our society are very new. The life of someone like Lenny is very different today than it was in the setting of the book. For most of human history, education was reserved for the wealthy and privileged. One of the great advances of modern society was the advent of public education, but there were still a lot of barriers to access in the early years. In history class, we cover pretty extensively the racial integration of the school system through events like Brown v. Board and the Little Rock Nine. Conversations about how to make our nation more fair and more just through education still continue to this day. But the education of people with disabilities has perhaps even more complex history and is really worth discussing. The earliest public education systems most often just ignored students with disabilities. In the 1950s, however, several small groups of parents advocating for the education of students with disabilities came together to form a national organization called NARC. According to the Department of Education, however, 20 years later in 1950, only 20% of all children with disabilities were being provided educational services. It's also estimated that at that time, 3.5 million children were living in state institutions where they received little to no education and had little to no hope of living a normal life. One of the most well documented examples of the treatment of people with disabilities comes from the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York City. Willowbrook opened in 1947 as an institution for mentally disabled children and was designed to house up to 4,000 students. By 1965, however, it was home to over 6,000 disabled children. When Robert Kennedy toured the facility in 1965, he came away somewhat shocked.
Well, I visited the State Institution for the Mentally Retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, that many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions. Both need a tremendous overhauling. I'm not saying that those who are the attendants there are the ones that run the institution are at fault. I think all of us are at fault. And I think it's just long overdue that something be done about it.
Perhaps the most terrible example of life in this school was the hepatitis studies carried out by medical researchers. Throughout the 60s and 70s, two doctors performed a number of studies in which they intentionally infected the patients of Willowbrook with hepatitis and allowed it to remain untreated. In one experiment, Dr. Saul Krugman took live hepatitis viruses from stool samples of sick people and put it into the food of 60 healthy children. Every one of those 60 children became infected with hepatitis A and suffered from yellowed eyes and skin, enlarged livers, persistent vomiting, and a lack of the ability to eat. In the 1970s, a journalist named Geraldo Rivera gained access to the school with a video camera. I'm going to show you just a little of the footage he got while there, but you should be warned that it's pretty disturbing.
The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, and the children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces, they were making a pitiful sound, a kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death. We've just seen something that's probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. Is that typical of ward life?
Yes, there are 5,300 patients at Willowbrook, which is the largest institution for the mentally retarded in the world. The ones that we saw were the most severely and profoundly retarded. There are thousands there like that, not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone.
The Willowbrook School did not officially close until 1987. Today, just a little over 30 years later, we look back at this school and are horrified. We cannot imagine treating other human beings in such a manner. But therein lies the information we need to understand this situation. Many people throughout most of American history did not view people with developmental disabilities as human beings. It was okay to experiment on them because they were less than human. The first truly significant reform for disabilities education came in the form of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. This law had many sections banning discrimination against people with disabilities, but the most important for this conversation was Section 504. Some of the people watching this video right now have what we still call a 504 plan. Section 504 in the school setting requires schools to provide a quote, free, appropriate public education to all children with disabilities. Prior to this, it was not uncommon for schools to charge extra fees to families of students with disabilities or to outright deny educational opportunities to these students. Some examples of accommodations that schools provide through 504 plans include allowing students receiving chemotherapy to wear hats, having functioning elevators available for students on crutches, special desks for a student who uses a wheelchair, seating nearest the board for a student with a visual impairment. Another increasingly common example is the issuance of a temporary 504 for a student who suffers a concussion playing sports. Allowing that student to wear sunglasses or take extra breaks can help students continue to learn while recovering from their injury. These things may seem like common sense today, but historically, it was not uncommon. In fact, it was usually the case to see that these were denied because of the cost associated with them. A second law that has impacted the education of students with disabilities is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. IDEA was passed in multiple different versions, multiple different times from 1975 to 1990. IDEA led to the implementation of individual education plans, or IEPs, which nationwide about 13% of students now have. An IEP is a yearly updated plan of how a school will provide the accommodations and supports necessary for a student with disabilities to learn successfully. One of the most important outcomes of these two pieces of legislation is the destigmatization of people with disabilities. Today, the vast majority of children with disabilities grow up to live normal lives and become functional members of society. Students with disabilities are now able to join the military, find well paying jobs, or go to college because of the extra effort to provide them with a high quality and free education when they're young. The final regulation I want to mention is the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. The ADA is a set of laws that made it so businesses and public spaces needed to provide reasonable accommodations with people with disabilities. These are things that you see every day and probably just take for granted, but are essential to helping people with disabilities navigate the world. Some examples of these accommodations include braille on signs, sign language interpreters, ramps into buildings, the bump pattern on sidewalks, curb cutouts so that wheelchairs can get up onto the sidewalk easier, and even automatic doors. These are all things that we see and use and interact with every day, but are incredibly important for people with disabilities and for most of history didn't exist, meaning that those people were then excluded from living a public life in society. There are many, many other pieces to this story that could make this lesson twice as long. But these few laws are some of the major turning points in the history of disabled Americans. It really is amazing how much our society has changed in this area so fast. We likely already take for granted too many of these incredible changes that have only precipitated in the past 40 years. It's important to think about these changes not just when we think about Of Mice and Men and the role of Lenny, but how they impact all of our lives every day. For your assignment, I want you to write a paragraph length response to this question. How have these laws and changes affected your life, the lives of your family, the lives of your friends and people you know? Maybe you have an IEP or a 504. Maybe you broke a bone once and needed special accommodations in school while you recovered. Maybe your grandma's in a wheelchair and because of automatic doors and ramps, she can still go shopping. Maybe you know someone who's blind and because of crosswalk bumps and beepers, or they're able to navigate society independently and safely. Write about how these changes have had an effect on your life or the lives of people you know.